Happy New Year, happy 2016 to you. I am your host, John Mosman, and this is the Beyond the Stone Table podcast. For those who are new listeners, thank you for bringing us into your new year with you and making us hopefully a new year resolution to listen to this podcast. Just to do a little bookkeeping, I want to inform you that I also have another project going on right now that you can find out more information about it on my website, and I promise I will put it on there. I am playing catch up, but I'm getting there. But that will all be on my website at johnmosman.com. And what I'm looking at doing is also, besides this podcast, is having an interview show. I know I love to do podcasts, and I know I love to do interview shows. So I'm like, why don't I do both? So I'm going back to an interview show format. But this time, instead of interviewing people who are not Christian, I'm going to be interviewing people who are just nothing but Christian. Because the reality is, I went out there seeking last couple of years answers, and I wanted to really get good criticism. I wanted to get good ideas, and I wanted to know what the best arguments, if you will, from people who are not Christian and who are not religious had to do. And I'll tell you what, there were very few. And those arguments were left wanting. And I realized the emptiness that's found in atheism, the emptiness that's found in not knowing that kind of truth and having faith in that kind of truth. And so I wanted to bring people who are of the faith, who are not just the Christian faith. They're not just people who can put the label on them, I'm a Christian, but people who actually espouse beliefs that are true to the tenets of the Christian faith that are found in the scriptures primarily, and the doctrines that have emerged from people who also have said this is found exactly in the Bible. The Bible talks about this a lot. That show will be called Theologically Speaking, and it will be with a new guest every month. I'm going to do one show a month. And this month, on January 18th, I have guest Chad L. Bird with me. He's an author, and he's a speaker, and he's been formally trained in seminary and has gone to college to study the Old Testament. So he's going to be an excellent guest for us to talk about some things. So don't forget about that show. So here we are, 2016, and here we are with the podcast 2.0 version, I say, right? We've just opened up the hood, we put in the new engine, and, well, here we are. Excuse me. So, coming to this point here, where we're talking about where does this podcast go from here? You know, I've already established, if you've listened to this podcast, my love for fantasy and folklore and particularly myth. And it's important that we rightly use the word myth, because a lot of times people use word myth and they mean something else. For example, someone might say that Jesus is a myth, right? And by that they mean Jesus is a myth in the sense that he doesn't exist, right? It's something that has no bearing on reality. Well, you can't say that. Because myth, in fact, is the opposite. And while it may not be completely the way it was told, or there are things that are not the same, the reality is myth is always a story. Myth may not tell you all the details. Myth may not be able to prove all the details. But it doesn't deny its truth. Because why we know it's found in reality is because it's based on things we find in reality. Things that we find in the real world. And so people want to say that myth is a bad thing, that myth is something that is only in our heads, it's something that we only think up in our heads. Well, that's just a lie. You know, people say Jesus is a myth. And of course, they like to so popularly lump him in with this flying spaghetti monster and unicorn. Well, there are some similarities to these things. One being that there is something of substantial truth found in them. For example, the unicorn. Well, the unicorn sure looks a lot like a horse, right? So it's not such a far-fetched to say there's an animal that's out there that is basically a horse with a horn on it. Or the flying spaghetti monster. Well, it would be spaghetti, I would imagine. It would have to have something inside of it or part of its skin or whatever that would be spaghetti. And we all know what spaghetti is, most of us. So where do these kind of accusations come from? Well, first of all, it's not only a complete misunderstanding of how the word myth should be used, but it's a complete misunderstanding of how myth forms itself, what makes myth. It's not that myth tells us a story that's not true. It's that it tells us a story that may seem untrue and may use some exaggerated things in it, but it is still a story. And Tolkien, especially J.R.R. Tolkien, understood this. He understood what the myth at its source is. And so when we say things like understanding the myth of Jesus, we're not talking about a made-up Jesus. We're not talking about saying that Jesus is not real or that there's parts of him that we don't know or fictional or whatever. What we're saying there, what I'm saying there, is that there's the story of Jesus. And that story has become a myth in the sense that it has gradually, over time, found root in everyday life throughout many societies. We see the same thing in other things. There's dragons, right? Almost every culture in the world at some point has some kind of myth about dragons. Well, does that mean that we're going to see any fire-breathing dragon at any point in our lives? Probably not. But we also know that there were dinosaurs. We also know that there are creatures that we still probably haven't discovered. We know that is very possible and happening. Especially if you watch shows like the Bigfoot Hunter, right? These people out there going out there finding it. I mean, there are probably places where they could exist. Now, am I putting my money on their existence? No, but I am putting my money on the fact that there are people out there who say they do. They've seen them. And at some point, that had to be based on something. It had to be based on something physical. Because you can't just come up with some random thing that doesn't exist, right? Almost everything you find in myth has to have something of reality. When you look at the popular fantasy stories, where do these things come from, right? Where do things that you find in these popular fantasy stories play a part at? Well, so much about it is found in real life. It's not hard to believe some of these things could actually happen or exist. With that said, though, this is where we need to make sure we have a proper distinction between fantasy and myth, because the way Tolkien and Lewis looked at the differences between them was that fantasy is something that made you escape. And you don't ever escape the reality. In fact, in Lewis's books, the Chronicles of Narnia, the more you get closer to the heart of Narnia, the more into Narnia you get, the more real it gets, right? Edmund starts off in the professor's house basically lying that he didn't seeing the Narnia. Lying to try to make his sister seem bad and to feel bad. And in the real world, that's harmless, right? His older brother and sister don't even think they don't think it's funny, they don't like it, they don't think it was the right thing to do, but they still don't think it's a serious offense. But we see that sin of Edmund, of wanting to do harm against his brother and sister, gets multiplied as soon as he goes to Narnia and he meets the White Witch. And what does she tell him? Well, of course, he's willing to give him up for what he wants. We see that selfishness amplified and ultimately puts himself and his family in potential peril. All of these things are factors. All of these things need to be looked at. A lot of times we're told myth is something as it's wrong or false or just simply not true. That's a wrong understanding. And you may be asking yourselves, why is he spending so much time talking about this? And I've talked about it before. Well, I want to bring to you the framework of what this podcast is going to be all about. The podcast is going to be about this understanding that at the framework, at the foundations of reality, the foundations of everything that we know within existence, there are fundamental truths, there are fundamental things, and we need to get back to it. And I hope in 2016 you will also come with me as I go back and to try to look at these things and understand them a little bit better. Because I think to just hear our critics say that you believe in a God that doesn't exist, and what they want is what? They want what they believe is scientific fact and evidence. They want evidence they think, will prove a God exists. But they never would accept that evidence, even if they did find it. But what is it important for Christians? Because this podcast is geared towards Christians. It's a podcast for people looking for that fundamental truth. We'll be talking about some of these fundamental truths. There's not a word that we use here, right? It's called orthodox. Pure, fundamental truth, right? It's the things that cannot be changed. It's the things that are true. It's the things that are completely true. And when I talk about my show, the new one that I'm going to be doing, when I'm going to be talking to these pastors and educated people in Christian guests, then what am I going to do? I'm going to do a show for and about and with Orthodox Christianity. Because there's so much false Christianity out there, and it's almost, if not worse, than some of the things being said by our critics who are not Christian, or not even pretending to be religious or Christian, even though some of them still want to be, and some of them still want to have a religion, even if it is a religion rejecting God. How do we get to these places? How do we understand these truths? I think there's something here. There is something here in this myth of understanding the myth of the story of Christ. See, his story and of his rise. You see that all the time. The reluctant hero, the person who is doing something in the name of honor of his God, his Father. These things all play a role. So, what do we do to talk about some of these fundamental truths, these fundamental realities that we find in myth, that we find in religion, that we find in the means in which normal materialistic people have shut themselves off to? Because I hate to admit it, folks, but people just don't think about these things anymore. There are a lot of people out there who don't even have an understanding of what classical theology is, classical philosophy, people who don't even think about those things. For a lot of people, they are living that dream of the materialist. Here's my cup in front of me, I'll just hold that on to that and keep on holding on to that till I die. But it's a prison. And it's the aim of this show, and it's the aim of this podcast, to wind a little bit of a time for those who may not know. A tool to free your mind. Because there is freedom in knowing these things. Now, some myths are popular, and they're not true. We do have to distinguish that also. Just because something is myth doesn't mean it's completely 100% true, though. But it doesn't also mean it's completely false. Now, I'm not also saying that religion is completely myth. Like, I'm not saying that, oh, well, there are some things that are not true, or some things that are made up. The reality is that does happen in religion, but it's not because of religion's fault. It's because people. You see, this is where myth comes back into the picture. Everyone wants to develop their own myth. Everyone wants to be their own storyteller, right? Because that's what myth is all about, the story. Remember, I just said that. So here we have, what do everyone want to do? They want to be their own storyteller. They want to be their own personal determining factor of what reality is, what is real, what is right, what is wrong. And so the fact is, myth is not a problem. Religion is not the problem. Is that people want to be their own religion. They want to be their own myth. They want to have their own reality. And when something of deep truth comes at them and faces them, they run away from it, or they get ugly and start to fight back at it. Because it's easier. It's easier to develop a myth that there is no God, that there is no there's no divine order, there's no purpose in things, it's all chaos. Now remember what I said about myth. Yes, there might be some things that are reality. And they could probably find things that can constitute their myth, their story. But a lot of it is that they've already chosen the story before they get the facts. I've interviewed atheists, and I've talked to atheists, multiple atheists. And they essentially said the same thing. Oh, I don't like how the Christians seemingly treat gays. I don't like this, that, or that. They already have preferences and biases, and it's based on those that they create their myth of there being no God, or having a God who doesn't play right. Many of them think, well, I know better than God, because God doesn't see what's going on. I see what's going on. There's all this wrong things going on, and he's not doing anything about it. That must mean he doesn't exist because he has a corrupt moral. What? If the basis of determining whether or not something was true or false was based on the fact that they're idiots, well then, there would be a lot of people who don't exist now. And there'd be moments in my life where I'd go, poof, I don't exist anymore. We all try to develop a myth and a story that we feel fits our lives. But there is a greater myth and a greater story that involves grace, mercy, love, sacrifice. And salvation. And there are places where you can hear the story. The story that is true. The story that is real. The story that has been verified. A story that has been defended. A story that has no need to edit. Pure. That doesn't mean everybody who speaks that myth or teaches on that myth is pure, or that they completely understand it, or that they're completely teaching from a place of authority on it. But the fact that they know some degree of it gives it its validation also. And if you come with me on this journey, we will explore and go into some of these things, because trust me, my friends, you will love to see what happens next.